The mafia boss yells at the shy waitress. She says 4 words that freeze the entire restaurant. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, let's continue. The amber glow of La Perla Nera's vintage Edison bulbs cast long shadows across tables draped in midnight black linen, creating an atmosphere of dangerous sophistication that whispered rather than screamed exclusivity. This wasn't a restaurant. It was a theater where power performed its nightly ritual. The clientele knew the unspoken rules. Speak in hushed tones, avert your eyes from certain tables, and never, ever question the man who occupied the corner booth every Thursday evening. Crystal wine glasses caught the light, like diamonds, and the soft clink of silverware against fine china created a rhythm of wealth and privilege. Politicians debated policy over 40-year-old scotch. Business tycoons sealed million-dollar deals between courses of truffle-infused risotto. And in the shadows, men whose fortunes came from less legitimate enterprises conducted transactions that would never appear on any balance sheet. La Perla Nera catered to them all with equal discretion and exquisite service. Omar the Reaper Licari sat with military precision, his back against exposed brick that had witnessed a century of the city's secrets. At 38, he was a contradiction sculpted in flesh and fear, a man whose tailored charcoal suit and platinum cufflinks spoke of boardroom respectability, while the scar bisecting his left eyebrow and the cold calculation in his dark eyes whispered of back-alley executions. His presence didn't fill the room, it suffocated it. Even the piano player in the corner seemed to play softer when Omar arrived, as if the music itself feared disturbing him. He commanded an empire built on loyalty, extracted through fear, and an iron fist that controlled half the city's underground operations. His name alone made seasoned criminals measure their words carefully. District attorneys who got too curious about Licari family business found their cases mysteriously falling apart. Witnesses developed convenient amnesia. Evidence disappeared from lockups. Omar didn't need to make threats. His reputation did the work for him, a ghost that haunted every conversation, every negotiation, every challenge to his authority. Your usual, Mr. Licari. The maitre d', Vincent, approached with the careful steps of a man navigating a minefield, his voice barely above a whisper. Omar didn't respond, his attention fixed on the iPhone in his hand. The blue light illuminated his angular features, highlighting the sharp jawline that could have graced magazine covers if those same magazines didn't speculate about his alleged connections to organized crime. Vincent retreated with visible relief, and the restaurant's pulse remained subdued. Everyone knew the stories, though no one spoke them aloud. Rival families who challenged the Licari name found their businesses inexplicably bankrupted. Business owners who refused protection woke to find their establishments reduced to ash and insurance claims denied. But nothing was ever proven. Omar the Reaper. Licari didn't need to prove anything. His reputation was judge, jury, and executioner. Margaret Hayes emerged from the kitchen's swinging doors, her small frame nearly hidden behind the tray of entrees she balanced with practiced precision. At 25, she moved through La Perla Nera like a ghost, present but unseen, efficient but invisible. Her auburn hair was pulled into a modest bun, and her black uniform was as unremarkable as she tried to be. She'd been working here for 3 years, every shift bringing her closer to her dream of nursing school, every tip carefully deposited into the account that would eventually free her from the weight of student loans. In her world, the opulence of La Perla Nera existed in a separate dimension from her reality, She served senators and CEOs, mobsters and movie producers, but she remained disconnected from their world of power and privilege. They were simply customers who needed food delivered and glasses refilled. Nothing more. She couldn't afford to think of them as anything more. "Margaret, wait!" Vincent's urgent whisper cut through the kitchen noise, but she was already through the doors, her focus on Table 9's complicated order. She'd noticed the corner booth was occupied. The man who sat there every week like clockwork, who never smiled, never made small talk, and always left a tip that made her hand shake when she counted it later. Margaret had served him 4 times before, and each time she'd approached his table with her heart in her throat, feeling the weight of his gaze like a physical pressure. She didn't know his full name, didn't want to know. In her world, you kept your head down, did your job, and went home to your tiny studio apartment where men like him didn't exist. "Your osso buco, Mr. Licari." Vincent placed the dish with the reverence of a priest handling communion, his hands trembling despite years of professional composure. "Chef Antonio prepared it exactly to your specifications." Omar's phone vibrated, a message from his underboss about a shipment discrepancy at the port. His jaw tightened imperceptibly as he read the encrypted text. Someone in his organization was either incompetent or suicidal. Either way, the problem would be handled with the efficiency that had earned him his nickname. The Reaper didn't just take lives, he harvested loyalty through fear. He cut into the braised veal with controlled aggression, his mind already 3 moves ahead, planning the conversation that would take place in the warehouse later that night. The Licari family didn't forgive mistakes. They made examples, permanent examples that served as warnings to anyone else who might consider stealing, lying, or showing the slightest hint of disloyalty. Margaret was halfway to Table 9 when the temperature in the restaurant dropped. She turned instinctively toward the corner booth, where the man in the expensive suit had gone completely still, staring at his plate with an expression that made her blood run cold. "This is unacceptable." Omar's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the ambient noise like a blade through silk, sharp and absolute. Every conversation died instantly. Every fork froze mid-air. "I asked for medium rare. This is raw." Vincent materialized beside the table, his face drained of color. "Mr. Licari, I sincerely apologize. I'll have Chef Antonio. I don't want excuses." Omar's words were ice. "I come here every week. Every week I order the same dish, and every week it's prepared correctly, until tonight." He pushed the plate away with disgust. "This is incompetence, pure incompetence." The entire restaurant held its collective breath. Waiters froze mid-step. Diners stared at their plates, desperate to become invisible. Even the piano player's hands hesitated over the keys before going silent entirely. Margaret watched the scene unfold, her tray growing heavy in her trembling hands. She'd seen the plate when Vincent carried it out. The meat had been cooked properly, she was certain of it. This wasn't about the food. This was about a man accustomed to absolute obedience, taking out his anger on whatever target presented itself. Before rational thought could stop her, before fear could root her in place, Margaret set down her tray and walked toward the corner booth. Her red apron felt like a target painted on her chest, but her feet kept moving. "Margaret, no." Vincent's whispered plea went unheeded. She stopped beside Omar's table, her blue eyes meeting his dark ones without flinching. Up close, she could see the barely controlled rage in his expression, the tension in his jaw, the way his hand gripped the steak knife like a weapon. She could also see something else, surprise that someone was approaching him instead of scattering like frightened birds. "Is there a problem, sir?" Her voice was steadier than she felt. Omar looked up at her, genuine shock flickering across his features. Most people couldn't meet his gaze. This waitress, this girl with her modest bun and simple uniform, was staring directly at him, waiting for an answer. "The problem," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "is that I'm paying premium prices for substandard quality. The meat is undercooked." "The meat is cooked exactly as you ordered it." Margaret didn't break eye contact. "I saw it before Vincent brought it out. Medium rare, with a warm red center, exactly as specified." The silence that followed was absolute. Someone's wine glass clinked against a plate, the sound explosive in the quiet. Omar stood slowly, his 6'3" frame towering over her. Men twice his size had stepped back from that posture. Hardened criminals had lowered their eyes under that stare. But Margaret held her ground, her chin tilted up slightly, her expression suggesting she was analyzing an interesting puzzle rather than facing down one of the most dangerous men in the city. "Are you telling me I'm wrong?" The question was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. Every survival instinct screamed at her to apologize, to back down, to run. But 3 years of swallowing her voice, of making herself small, of accepting disrespect from men who thought their money bought them the right to treat staff like furniture, it all crystallized into 4 words she never planned to say. "I'm not afraid of you." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Vincent looked like he might faint. The other diners stared in horrified fascination, waiting for the explosion that was sure to come. The kitchen doors swung open slightly as staff peered out to witness what would surely be a catastrophe. Omar, the Reaper. Likari, the man who controlled an empire through fear, the man who made federal prosecutors nervous, found himself speechless. No one had ever spoken to him like this. Not in years. Not since he'd built his reputation on the ashes of those who'd challenged him. And this girl, this waitress with her defiant eyes and straight spine, didn't even seem to fully comprehend who he was or what he was capable of doing. For the first time in a decade, Omar felt something other than cold calculation. He felt fascination, genuine, undeniable fascination with someone who had the courage to stand their ground when everyone else cowered. "What's your name?" His voice had changed, losing its sharp edge. "Margaret." She didn't add sir or show any deference. The ghost of a smile touched Omar's lips. He sat back down slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "The meat is fine, Margaret." The admission seemed to cost him something. "You were right." The restaurant exhaled collectively, though the tension remained thick enough to cut. Margaret nodded once, her professional mask sliding back into place, despite the adrenaline screaming through her veins. "Is there anything else you need?" "No." Omar's gaze intensified, studying her like she was a code he needed to crack. "But I'm sure I'll think of something." Margaret turned and walked back toward the kitchen, her legs somehow carrying her despite feeling like water. The restaurant remained frozen for another heartbeat before conversations resumed in hushed, urgent whispers. She pushed through the swinging doors, and the moment they closed behind her, her knees buckled. She caught herself against the stainless steel prep counter, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "Are you insane?" Marco, the sous chef, stared at her with wide eyes. "Do you have any idea what you just did? Who that man is?" "I know exactly who he is." Margaret's voice shook despite her words. Her hands trembled as she pressed them flat against the cool metal surface. "Everyone knows who Omar Likari is." "Then you know people don't talk to him like that." Vincent burst through the doors, his face still pale. "People who cross Omar Likari end up in the river, Margaret, or they simply disappear. And you just stood there and told him you weren't afraid of him." The meat was cooked properly. even to her own ears. The justification sounded weak. He was being unreasonable. He's always unreasonable when he wants to be. That's the privilege of being Omar Likari. Vincent ran a shaking hand through his graying hair. You smile, you apologize, you offer to remake the dish. You don't contradict him. You certainly don't challenge him in front of the entire restaurant. The other servers gathered at a distance, their whispers creating a buzz of speculation and horror. Margaret could feel their stares like insects crawling across her skin. Some looked at her with something resembling admiration. Most looked at her like she was already dead. What's going to happen to me? The question escaped before she could stop it, and suddenly Margaret felt very young and very foolish. Vincent's expression softened slightly. I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe he was amused by your courage, or maybe... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Should I leave? Quit before there's trouble? And go where? Marco asked quietly. If Omar Likari wants to find you, he'll find you. Running just makes you look guilty of something worse than speaking your mind. Margaret picked up another tray with mechanical precision, her training overriding her panic. Then I'll finish my shift. She pushed back through the doors into the dining room, acutely aware of the corner booth in her peripheral vision. She delivered meals to table 9, refilled wine glasses at table 4, brought dessert menus to table 12. Through it all, she could feel Omar's gaze following her across the restaurant like a physical touch. He ate his ossobuco slowly, methodically. His phone forgotten on the table beside him. Every time Margaret glanced in his direction, and she couldn't help glancing, he was watching her, not with anger, not with the cold promise of retribution, with something that looked almost like curiosity and that frightened her more than rage would have. What did a man like Omar Likari find curious? And more importantly, what did he do with things that caught his interest? Omar cut into the perfectly cooked veal, barely tasting it despite its exquisite preparation. His mind was entirely occupied with the waitress who'd looked him in the eye and refused to back down. Margaret. The name felt ordinary, unremarkable, nothing like the woman who'd spoken those 4 impossible words. I'm not afraid of you. He'd built an empire on fear. Fear was his currency, his weapon, his shield. For a decade, he'd watched people crumble under the weight of his reputation, seen grown men stammer and sweat in his presence, witnessed business rivals fold before negotiations even began. Fear was reliable. Fear was predictable. But this girl hadn't shown fear. Nervousness, yes. Her hands had trembled slightly, but her eyes had been clear, her voice steady, her spine straight. She'd assessed him, found him wanting, and said so to his face. No one did that. No one dared. Omar's underboss, Luca, would expect a response to such blatant disrespect. The old guard in his organization would demand an example be made. Word would spread that Omar Likari had been challenged by a waitress and done nothing. Weakness invited predators, and in his world, perceived weakness was indistinguishable from actual weakness. But as he watched Margaret move through the restaurant with practiced efficiency, he felt no anger, only a fascination he hadn't experienced in years, perhaps ever. She'd surprised him, and surprises were rare in a life where everyone followed the same predictable script of deference and terror. He finished his meal, left his customary generous tip, and added something extra, an additional $500 bills, folded beneath his empty water glass, where Margaret would find them later. Not a payment, not a threat, a message, though he wasn't entirely sure what message he intended to send. As Omar stood to leave, Margaret was clearing table 7. Their eyes met across the restaurant one final time. He nodded slightly, an acknowledgement, a promise, a question. Then he walked out into the night, his security detail materializing from the shadows to flank him. Vincent found Margaret after closing, as she was untying her apron with exhausted, trembling fingers. "He left something for you." He placed the folded bills on the counter between them. Margaret stared at the money like it might bite her. "I can't accept this." "You don't have a choice. Refusing Omar Lakari's generosity is almost as dangerous as accepting it. Either way, you're in his orbit now." Vincent's expression was sympathetic but grim. "Go home, get some rest, and pray that his interest in you is fleeting." But as Margaret rode the subway back to her tiny studio apartment, the bills burning in her purse like hot coals, she knew with sickening certainty that Omar's interest was anything but fleeting. 3 nights passed. 3 nights where Margaret jumped at every unexpected sound, checked over her shoulder constantly, and barely slept. She'd called in sick the next 2 shifts, unable to face returning to La Perlanera. But bills didn't pay themselves, and nursing school tuition was due in 6 weeks. On Thursday evening she found herself once again tying on her black apron, her hands shaking so badly she had to start over twice. "He requested you specifically." Vincent's voice was flat, resigned. "Table 1, his booth." Margaret's stomach dropped. "He's here? Arrived 10 minutes ago, asked if you were working tonight." Vincent met her eyes. "I'm sorry, Margaret. I tried to tell him you were assigned to a different section, but he was very clear. You serve him or he takes his business elsewhere." She wanted to run. Wanted to rip off her apron and disappear into the night. Instead, she picked up her notepad and walked toward the corner booth on legs that felt borrowed from someone braver. Omar sat in his usual position, back to the wall, surveying the restaurant like a king observing his domain. He'd changed nothing about his appearance, the same expensive suit, the same calculated posture, but something in his expression was different, softer perhaps, or maybe that was wishful thinking. "Good evening, Mr. Lakari." Professional, polite, exactly what Vincent had begged her to be. "Margaret." The way he said her name made her pulse quicken. "I was hoping you'd be here tonight." "I work Thursday nights." She gripped her pen tighter, using it as an anchor to reality. "Yes, I made sure to verify your schedule with Vincent." He paused, letting that information sink in. "Sit down." "I'm working, sir. I can't." "Sit down." Not a request this time. "Just for a moment, please." That last word, spoken with unexpected gentleness, made her decision. Margaret slid into the booth across from him, acutely aware of every eye in the restaurant turning toward them. This wasn't normal. Nothing about this was normal. "You've been avoiding me," Omar observed. "I've been sick." "You're a terrible liar." A slight smile played at his lips. "Your hands are shaking. You keep glancing at the exit. You think I'm going to hurt you." "Are you?" The question escaped before wisdom could stop it. Omar leaned back, studying her with those dark, calculating eyes. "If I wanted to hurt you, Margaret, you'd already know it. I don't play games with threats." "I don't need to." "Then what do you want from me?" "I want to understand you." His voice was quiet, intense. "I want to know what makes a waitress look a man like me in the eye, and tell him she's not afraid. I want to know if you were telling the truth, or if you're simply braver than you are smart." Margaret met his gaze, and despite every survival instinct screaming at her to look away, she held it. Both, probably. For the first time, Omar laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his face from dangerous to almost handsome. "Honest. I appreciate honesty. It's rare in my world." "I imagine everything is rare in your world, Mr. Lakari, including people who'll tell you the truth." "You have no idea." The laughter faded, replaced by something darker. 3 nights ago, you said you weren't afraid of me. Are you afraid now?" Margaret considered lying, considered giving him the answer he might want to hear, but she'd already committed to honesty, and there was no walking that back now. "Yes," she admitted quietly, "I'm terrified, but not of you hurting me physically. I'm afraid of what it means that you're asking me these questions. I'm afraid of becoming interesting to someone like you, because people in your world don't have normal lives. They have complications." "Smart girl." Omar's expression grew serious. "You should be afraid. You should finish this conversation, serve me my dinner, and forget we ever spoke." "But you won't let me do that." "No." The word was soft but absolute. "I won't." The admission hung between them like smoke. Margaret stood slowly, her legs steadier now despite her fear. "What would you like to eat, Mr. Lakari?" "Omar." His voice stopped her. "When we're talking like this, call me Omar." "That wouldn't be appropriate." "Nothing about this situation is appropriate, Margaret, but it's happening anyway." She nodded once, her professional mask sliding back into place. "What would you like to eat, Omar?" His smile was predatory and pleased all at once. "Surprise me. Bring me whatever Chef Antonio recommends. I trust your judgment." As Margaret walked back toward the kitchen, she could feel his gaze following her every step. Vincent was right. She was in Omar's orbit now, caught in a gravitational pull she didn't understand and couldn't escape. The question wasn't whether she was afraid. The question was whether she was brave enough to survive what came next. The following Thursday, Omar returned, and the Thursday after that. And every Thursday for the next month, his presence at La Perlanera became as predictable as the tides, except now he didn't just occupy the corner booth, he occupied Margaret's every waking thought. "Table 1 for you again," Vincent said, not even pretending surprise anymore. His tone had shifted from concern to resignation, as if he'd accepted that whatever was happening between Margaret and Omar Lakari was beyond his control or understanding. Margaret approached the corner booth with the same knot of anxiety that had become familiar, though the sharp edge of terror had dulled slightly with repetition. Omar looked up as she approached, and something in his expression had softened over the past weeks. He still commanded the room with his presence, still made conversations hush when he entered, but with her, the dangerous edges seemed less pronounced. "Good evening, Margaret." He'd stopped letting her use his surname weeks ago, insisting on the intimacy of his first name despite her protests. "Good evening, Omar." She'd learned that resistance on small matters only prolonged the inevitable. "Your usual?" "Actually, no." He set down his phone, giving her his full attention in a way that made her pulse quicken. "Tell me what you'd recommend. What does someone who works here actually enjoy eating?" The question caught her off guard. "I don't usually eat here. The staff menu is different from what's served to guests." Pretend money isn't an issue. Pretend you're celebrating something important. What would you order? Margaret hesitated, uncertain whether this was a test or genuine curiosity. "The seafood risotto. Chef Antonio makes it with saffron and scallops that are somehow both delicate and rich. It's beautiful." "Then bring me that." Omar's smile was slight but genuine. "And tell me what you'd be celebrating. In this hypothetical scenario where you're dining here instead of serving." "Getting into nursing school, probably." The answer came automatically, before she could consider whether sharing personal information with Omar Lakari was wise. "Probably? You're not certain?" Margaret shifted her weight, aware that other tables needed attention, but unable to extract herself from the conversation. "I applied to 3 programs. I'm still waiting to hear back from 2 of them. And the 3rd? Accepted me. But the tuition is more than I'd planned for, even with my savings." She stopped. suddenly aware she was explaining her financial situation to a man who probably spent more on watches than she'd earned in 5 years. "I'll make it work. I always do." Something flickered in Omar's eyes. Respect, perhaps. "You're determined." "I don't have the luxury of being anything else." The words came out sharper than intended, and Margaret immediately regretted them. "I'm sorry. That was unprofessional." It was honest. Omar leaned forward slightly. "I'm tired of professional, Margaret. Everyone in my life is professional. They tell me what they think I want to hear, what serves their interests, what keeps them safe. You tell me the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. The truth isn't always safe." "No," he agreed quietly, "but it's real. And real is something I haven't experienced in a very long time." Margaret felt something shift between them, a subtle change in the atmosphere that made her hyper-aware of how close they were sitting, how his dark eyes seemed to see past her carefully maintained composure. She stood quickly, needing distance. "I'll put in your order." "Margaret." His voice stopped her. "How much more do you need? For tuition?" Her stomach dropped. "I'm not asking you for money. I'm not offering charity. I'm asking a question. A question I'm not going to answer." She met his gaze steadily, finding courage in the familiar territory of defiance. "I can take care of myself, Omar. I don't need rescuing, especially not from someone whose help would come with strings I can't afford." For a moment, she thought she'd gone too far. But then Omar smiled, that rare, genuine expression that transformed his entire face. "There she is, the woman who told me she wasn't afraid. I was starting to think you'd forgotten how to stand your ground." "I remember perfectly well. I just choose my battles more carefully now." "Wise." He picked up his phone. A dismissal. "The risotto sounds perfect." As the weeks progressed, the conversations grew longer and more personal. Omar asked about her childhood, her parents who'd died when she was 19, the aunt who'd raised her afterward but passed away 2 years ago from cancer. He listened with an intensity that suggested he was memorizing every detail, filing away information about her life like pieces of a puzzle he was determined to solve. In return, Margaret found herself asking questions she'd never dare ask anyone else, about his family, his business, the weight of reputation and legacy. Omar answered some questions with surprising candor and deflected others with practiced ease. But even his silences told her things, revealed the careful boundaries he maintained between his world and the parts of himself he kept hidden. The restaurant staff had stopped whispering and started staring. Margaret felt their gazes constantly, measuring her interactions with Omar, speculating about what it meant that he requested her service exclusively, that he arrived earlier and stayed later just to talk with her between serving other tables. "You're playing with fire," Marco told her one night after closing as they cleaned the kitchen. "Everyone knows it. The question is whether you know it." "I'm not playing with anything. I'm doing my job." "Your job is serving food, not having hour-long conversations with the most dangerous man in the city." Marco's voice held concern rather than judgment. "People are starting to talk, Margaret, and when people talk about Omar Lakari's personal life, bad things tend to happen. What am I supposed to do? Refuse to serve him? That seems more dangerous than being polite." "There's polite, and then there's whatever this is." Marco gestured vaguely. "You smile differently when you're at his table. You lean in when you talk to him. You're not afraid anymore, and that should terrify you." But Margaret was afraid, just not in the way Marco meant. She was afraid of the flutter in her stomach when Omar smiled, afraid of how she'd started thinking about him during her morning classes, wondering what he was doing, whether he was thinking about her too. Afraid of the magnetic pull she felt toward a man whose world was built on violence and control, whose hands had almost certainly done terrible things, whose very existence should repel her, but somehow didn't. The shift in how others treated her became impossible to ignore. The other servers gave her wider berth, as if proximity to Omar's interest might contaminate them. Regular customers who'd never noticed her before now watched her carefully, assessing whether she posed a threat or offered an opportunity. Even Vincent's demeanor had changed from paternal concern to cautious respect, as if she'd transformed from employee to something more dangerous and unpredictable. "The usual booth is reserved for you tonight," a hostess told her one Friday evening, handing her a small envelope with her name written in elegant script. "This was left for you." Inside was a simple card. "Join me for dinner after your shift, not as my server, as my guest. Omar." Margaret's hands trembled as she read the invitation. This was different from their careful conversations across the table, different from the subtle dance they'd been performing for weeks. This was an escalation, an acknowledgement that whatever existed between them had moved beyond the professional boundaries she'd been clinging to for safety. She should refuse, should maintain the distance that kept this situation from becoming something she couldn't control. But as she looked across the restaurant to where Omar sat, watching her with patient expectation, Margaret realized the distance had been an illusion all along. She was already in too deep. Had been since the moment she'd looked him in the eye and refused to back down. When her shift ended at 11, Margaret changed out of her uniform into the simple blue dress she kept in her locker for emergencies. Her reflection in the staff room mirror showed a woman balanced between fear and anticipation, someone she barely recognized. Vincent caught her arm as she headed toward the dining room. "You don't have to do this. I can tell him you already left, that there was a family emergency." "And then what? He comes back next week and I explain that I lied? That seems worse." "Maybe." Vincent's expression was grave. "Or maybe you establish boundaries now, before this becomes something neither of you can walk away from." "I think we're already past that point." She found Omar at a table by the window, the restaurant empty except for them and the minimal staff required to keep the kitchen operational. He'd removed his suit jacket, loosened his tie, and somehow looked both more dangerous and more human in the dim lighting. "You came." He stood as she approached, pulling out her chair with old-fashioned courtesy that seemed incongruous with his reputation. "You made it sound like refusing wasn't really an option." "There's always an option, Margaret. You could have walked out the back door and never returned, but you didn't." He sat across from her, studying her face. "Why didn't you?" She could have lied, could have claimed professional obligation or financial necessity. Instead, she chose the honesty that had defined every interaction between them. "Because I wanted to know what this would feel like, sitting here as your equal instead of your server. And because despite every logical reason to stay away from you, I can't seem to make myself do it." Omar's expression softened in a way she'd never seen before. "I know the feeling. I've been trying to stay away from you for weeks, trying to convince myself that this fascination would fade if I just waited it out. But every Thursday, I find myself here. Every conversation with you makes me want another one. You've become a problem I can't solve, Margaret Hayes. Is that what I am to you? A problem? You're a complication in a life I'd organized to avoid exactly this kind of vulnerability." He reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of touching hers. "You make me want things I'd convinced myself I didn't need. Honesty, connection, someone who sees past the reputation to the person underneath." "I see both," Margaret said quietly. "I'm not naive enough to pretend you're someone other than who you are, but I'm also not willing to reduce you to just your worst actions. Maybe you should be. It would be safer." "Safe is overrated." She placed her hand over his, feeling the warmth of his skin, the slight tremor that suggested he was as affected by this moment as she was. "And I stopped feeling safe the moment I told you I wasn't afraid." Omar's fingers closed around hers, gentle despite their strength. Then let's stop pretending either of us knows how this ends. Let's just see where it goes. As Chef Antonio brought out courses Margaret had never tasted, as Omar told her stories about growing up in his family's shadow. As the night stretched into early morning with conversation that felt both ordinary and impossible, Margaret felt the last of her resistance crumble. She was falling for Omar Likari. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt inevitable, like gravity had been pulling her toward this moment since the first time their eyes met across a restaurant full of fear and whispered warnings. The only question now was whether falling would destroy her or set her free. The first sign came on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after that dinner with Omar. Margaret was leaving her afternoon anatomy class when she noticed a black sedan parked across from the nursing school entrance. Nothing unusual in itself, except the same car had been there when she arrived 2 hours earlier, engine idling, windows tinted too dark to see inside. She told herself it was paranoia. The city was full of black sedans. People waited in cars for countless innocent reasons. But as she walked toward the subway station, the sedan pulled away from the curb and followed at a careful distance, maintaining exactly 3 car lengths behind her. Margaret's pulse quickened. She turned down a side street she normally wouldn't take, watching from the corner of her eye. The sedan turned too. She stopped at a bodega, pretending to examine fruit in the outdoor display. The sedan pulled over half a block away and waited. By the time she reached the subway, her hands were shaking. She took the stairs 2 at a time, slipping through the turnstile just as a train pulled into the station. She boarded and watched through the window as 2 men in dark suits appeared at the platform entrance, scanning the crowd with methodical precision. They weren't threatening her. They were watching her. And somehow, that felt worse. That night at La Perlanera, Margaret moved through her shift with heightened awareness, jumping at sudden movements, monitoring the entrance compulsively. Omar hadn't arrived yet, which was unusual for a Thursday. His absence felt like a missing piece, and she hated that she'd started to rely on his presence for a sense of security. "You seem distracted," Marco observed, watching her nearly drop a tray of wine glasses. "Everything okay?" Before she could answer, the restaurant doors opened and Omar walked in, flanked by 2 men Margaret had never seen before. His security detail, she realized. He'd never brought obvious bodyguards before, had always maintained the fiction of being just another wealthy customer. Tonight the pretense was gone. His eyes found hers immediately across the crowded dining room. Even from a distance she could see the tension in his shoulders, the hard set of his jaw. Something had happened, something that made him drop his carefully constructed mask of normalcy. He nodded toward his usual booth, and Margaret found herself walking toward him without conscious decision, her body responding to his unspoken command in a way that should have alarmed her but instead felt natural. "We need to talk." Omar's voice was low, urgent. "Not here. After your shift." "Omar, what's wrong?" "Not here," he repeated, his gaze moving past her to scan the restaurant with predatory alertness. "Someone's watching you. Has been for 3 days. I need to know if you've noticed anything unusual." Margaret's stomach dropped. "The black sedan." "Outside my school today. It followed me to the subway." Omar's expression went carefully blank in the way she'd learned meant he was containing rage. "What time?" "Around 4. 2 men in suits got out when I entered the station, but I took the train before they could approach me." "Good." He pulled out his phone, typing rapidly. "That's good. You did the right thing." He looked up at her, and for the first time since they'd met, Margaret saw something like fear in his eyes. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. You're visible now. People in my world have noticed you, and they're trying to determine if you're a weakness they can exploit." "Who are they?" "Rival families, business competitors, people who'd love nothing more than to find leverage against me." His hand moved toward hers, but stopped short of touching, maintaining professional distance despite the intimacy of their conversation. I should have been more careful, should have kept you at arm's length. This is my fault. I'm not a child, Omar. I made my own choices. Choices based on incomplete information. His voice was tight with controlled emotion. You didn't sign up for this, for being followed and watched and assessed as a potential target. Margaret slid into the booth across from him, abandoning any pretense of server and customer. Then tell me what I actually signed up for. Stop protecting me from information I need to make informed decisions. Omar was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he weighed his words. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. My world operates on power and perception. If people believe you matter to me, if they think hurting you would hurt me, then you become currency in negotiations I never wanted you part of. 3 days ago, word spread through certain channels that Omar Lakari has been spending unusual amounts of time with a waitress, that he's been seen talking to her, looking at her differently than he looks at anyone else, and now people are asking questions about who you are and what you mean to me. What do I mean to you? The question escaped before wisdom could stop it. Omar's eyes met hers with devastating intensity. More than you should. More than is safe for either of us. Which is exactly the problem. So what do? You walk away. Tonight. You quit this job. You change your routine. You make yourself invisible again. I'll make sure you're financially taken care of, that nursing school is paid for, that you have everything you need. But you disappear from my life before someone decides the best way to get to me is through you. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. You're pushing me away. I'm keeping you alive. His voice was rough with emotion he wasn't quite managing to contain. Do you understand what happens to people who get caught in the crossfire of my world? They don't just get scared or threatened, Margaret. They disappear. They get used as messages, as warnings, as demonstrations of what happens when someone dares to challenge the wrong person. And you think walking away will make me safe? That whoever's watching me will just forget I exist because I'm no longer serving you dinner? It's a start. It's a fantasy. Margaret leaned forward, matching his intensity. You said it yourself. People already know about me. They already see me as connected to you. Disappearing now just makes me look like someone with something to hide, someone running scared. That makes me a target, not safe. Omar's expression suggested he'd already considered this and hated the conclusion it led to. Then what do you suggest? I suggest you stop trying to make decisions for me and start treating me like someone capable of understanding risk and choosing anyway. Her voice was steady despite her racing heart. I'm not naive, Omar. I knew getting involved with you was dangerous. But I'm also not willing to live my life in fear of what might happen. That's not living. That's just existing. You have no idea what you're asking for. Then tell me. Stop hiding behind vague warnings and actually explain what the worst-case scenario looks like. Omar's hand finally closed over hers, his grip tight enough to hurt. The worst-case scenario is that someone takes you to get to me. They hurt you to send me a message or to force my hand in a negotiation. They use you as leverage because they know I'd do anything to keep you safe, including things that would weaken my position, compromise my organization, or destroy everything I've built. That's the worst-case scenario, Margaret. You become the weapon someone uses to destroy me, and there's nothing either of us can do to stop it. The words hung between them, brutal in their honesty. Margaret felt the weight of what he was describing, the reality of loving someone whose enemies would see her as nothing more than collateral damage and the best-case scenario. Her voice was quieter now, but no less determined. There isn't one. Not one where you stay involved with me and remain safe. What if I don't care about safe? She turned her hand in his, interlacing their fingers. What if I'd rather have something real and dangerous than something safe and empty? Omar looked at her like she was speaking a language he'd forgotten how to understand. You should care about safe. You should want a normal life with someone who doesn't bring violence and chaos everywhere he goes. Maybe, but we don't always want what we should. Margaret squeezed his hand. I'm not walking away, Omar. Not because I'm brave or foolish, but because whatever this is between us, it matters more than my fear of what might happen. For a long moment, Omar said nothing. Then he stood abruptly, pulling her up with him. Come with me, now. I'm still working. My shift doesn't end for another 2 hours. Vincent will understand. He was already moving toward the exit, keeping her close to his side. His security detail materialized from their positions near the bar, flanking them as they walked out into the night. The black SUV waiting at the curb had windows even darker than the sedan that had followed her. Omar opened the door himself, ushering her inside before sliding in beside her. The moment the door closed, the vehicle pulled smoothly into traffic. Where are we going? Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Somewhere we can talk without being overheard or watched. Somewhere I can make sure you understand exactly what you're committing to before you make a decision you can't take back. They drove in silence through city streets that grew progressively less familiar, eventually pulling up to a building Margaret recognized from news reports. One of the city's most exclusive residential towers, the kind where penthouses sold for tens of millions and security was tighter than most banks. Omar's apartment occupied the entire top floor, accessed by a private elevator that required both a keycard and fingerprint scan. The doors opened directly into a space that was somehow both luxurious and austere, expensive but impersonal, like a hotel suite where someone lived but never truly settled. This is your home? Margaret turned slowly, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering city. The minimalist furniture that looked more functional than comfortable. This is where I sleep when I'm not working. Home implies something softer than what this place is. Omar moved to the bar, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey without asking if she wanted one. I brought you here because this is the only place in the city where I know with absolute certainty that no one is listening, where we can be completely honest, without consequences. He handed her a glass and gestured toward the leather sofa facing the windows. Margaret sat, the whiskey burning pleasantly as she sipped it, giving her something to do with her trembling hands. Omar remained standing, his silhouette dark against the city lights. I'm going to tell you things tonight that I've never told anyone. Not my underboss, not my closest associates, not the therapist my mother insisted I see after my father died. And after I'm done, you're going to make a choice. Stay or go. No judgment either way. But you'll make that choice with all the information, not just the parts I thought you could handle. I'm listening. He turned to face her, and in the low lighting, she could see the weariness in his expression, the weight of years of violence and control. My father built the Lakari Empire on fear and blood. When I was 16, I watched him execute a man in our living room for the crime of stealing $50,000. Not humanely, not quickly. He made it last hours as a lesson to me and to the others who were forced to watch. That's the world I inherited, Margaret. That's the legacy I carry. And no matter how much I try to evolve it, to make it cleaner or more civilized, the foundation is still built on suffering. Margaret listened as Omar spoke about growing up in a world where violence was currency, where loyalty was purchased through fear, where showing weakness meant death. He told her about the first time he'd had to make an example of someone, how he'd vomited afterwards, but learned to hide the revulsion until it eventually stopped coming. He described the careful balance of appearing ruthless enough to maintain control while trying to minimize the actual body count, the impossible mathematics of running an organization built on brutality. "I've killed people, Margaret. Not many, and always when there was no other option. But their blood is on my hands, literally and metaphorically. I've ordered things done that keep me awake at night. I've made decisions that destroyed families, ruined lives, left scars that will never heal." His voice was flat, emotionless, as if he'd divorced himself from the weight of his confessions. "That's who you'd be choosing, not the man who sits in that booth at La Perlonera, not the version of me who asks about your nursing school applications and listens to your stories. You'd be choosing all of it. The blood, the violence, the knowledge that the man you care about has done unforgivable things and will likely have to do them again." When he finished, silence filled the apartment like smoke. Margaret stared into her whiskey glass, processing everything he'd told her, feeling the weight of it settle into her bones. "Say something," Omar finally said, his voice rough. "Scream at me. Tell me I'm a monster. Walk out. Just say something." Margaret looked up at him. This man who'd just laid bare his darkest truths, who'd given her every reason to run, and was clearly bracing for her to do exactly that. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly. "Not because I think I can change you or save you or any of that naive romantic nonsense, but because I see you, Omar, all of you, the parts you're proud of and the parts that disgust you. And I'm choosing to stay anyway." The expression on his face was something between relief and disbelief. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, pulling her up from the sofa and into his arms with a desperation that spoke of years of isolation, of pretending not to need anyone, of building walls so high he'd forgotten what it felt like to let someone in. "You're going to regret this," he murmured against her hair. "Probably." Margaret held him tighter. "But it'll be my regret, my choice, and that has to count for something." The call came at 3 in the morning. Margaret woke to her phone vibrating insistently on the nightstand, Omar's name illuminated on the screen. She'd fallen asleep in his apartment after their conversation, curled against him on the sofa, while he absently traced patterns on her shoulder and stared at the city lights like they held answers to questions he couldn't articulate. "Hello?" Her voice was thick with sleep. "Are you home?" Omar's tone was sharp, urgent. "Tell me you went home after I dropped you off." Margaret sat up, suddenly alert. "Yes, I'm in my apartment. What's wrong?" "Lock your door, all the locks. Don't open it for anyone except me." She could hear movement in the background, voices speaking in rapid Italian. "I'm sending 2 of my men to your building. They'll be outside your door in 15 minutes. Do not leave your apartment until I get there." "Omar, you're scaring me. What happened?" A pause, heavy with the weight of things he didn't want to say. "Marco Calvetti made a move tonight, hit one of my warehouses, took out 3 of my men, and he left a message that mentioned you by name." Ice flooded Margaret's veins. "What kind of message?" "The kind that means he knows exactly how to hurt me." Omar's voice was strained, barely containing rage. "I'll explain everything when I get there. Just stay inside and stay safe." The line went dead. Margaret sat in the darkness of her tiny studio apartment, listening to the familiar sounds of her building that suddenly felt sinister. Every creak of floorboards, every slam of a distant door made her flinch. She checked the locks 3 times, pushed her dresser against the door for good measure, and sat on her bed with her phone clutched in her hand, waiting. True to Omar's word, exactly 15 minutes later came a quiet knock. "Miss Hayes, Mr. Licari sent us. Names are Tony and Sal. We'll be right outside your door until he arrives." She recognized one of the voices from Omar's security detail. The knowledge that armed men were stationed outside her apartment should have terrified her. Instead, she felt a guilty sense of relief. Omar arrived 40 minutes later, his suit jacket missing, his white shirt stained with something dark that Margaret desperately hoped wasn't blood. The carefully controlled man she knew had been replaced by someone harder, colder, radiating a violence that made the air feel heavy. "Move the dresser," he said shortly, and she heard Tony and Sal helping him shift it aside before he entered her apartment alone. The moment the door closed behind him, his composure cracked slightly. He crossed to her in 2 strides, his hands framing her face, his eyes scanning her like he was checking for injuries he knew weren't there. "You're okay. You're safe." The words seemed meant more for himself than for her. "What happened tonight, Omar? Who is Marco Calvetti?" He released her, moving to her small window to peer through the blinds at the street below. "Marco Calvetti runs the North End territory. We've had an understanding for years. He stays on his side of the city, I stay on mine, and we both pretend we're not constantly testing each other's boundaries." His jaw tightened. 2 weeks ago, I rejected a partnership he proposed, something that would have expanded his influence at the expense of my organization's stability. He didn't take the rejection well. "So he attacked your warehouse?" "The warehouse I could handle. That's business. Expected even." Omar turned to face her, and the expression in his eyes made her breath catch. "But he left a photograph. You leaving La Perlanera last Thursday, and a note that said, 'Beautiful things break so easily. Would be a shame if something happened to yours.'" Margaret sank onto her bed, the implications crashing over her. "He's threatening me to get to you. He's declaring war using you as the opening salvo." Omar's hands clenched into fists. "This is exactly what I warned you about. You're not just in my orbit anymore, Margaret. You're a target. A weakness Marco thinks he can exploit. What are you going to do?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. Neither wanted to examine too closely. Omar was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was different, colder. The voice of the Reaper, rather than the man who'd held her on his sofa hours earlier. "I'm going to remind Marco Calvetti why people fear the Licari name. I'm going to make it very clear that touching you means declaring war on my entire organization, and that war would leave him and everyone he cares about in ruins." "That sounds like you're planning to hurt people." "I'm planning to protect what's mine." His eyes met hers, fierce and possessive. "And whether you like it or not, whether it's safe or smart or morally defensible, you're mine now, Margaret. Which means anyone who threatens you is threatening me, and I don't let threats go unanswered." She should have been horrified. Should have recognized the dangerous possessiveness in his tone, the casual way he spoke about violence as if it were inevitable. Instead, some primitive part of her responded to the ferocity in his voice, the absolute certainty that he would burn down the world to keep her safe. There has to be another way, something that doesn't end in more bloodshed. There isn't. Omar moved to sit beside her on the bed, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion and resignation. "This is my world, Margaret. This is how things work. Marco made a move, and if I don't respond with overwhelming force, I look weak. And weakness in my world is a death sentence." "Then change the world. Rewrite the rules." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You make it sound simple. Like I can just decide to be different and everyone will accept it. But my organization has expectations. My people have been trained for decades to operate a certain way, and the other families, they're watching constantly for any sign that the Licari Empire is softening. that Omar the Reaper has lost his edge. He ran a hand through his hair, destroying what was left of its careful styling. I've been trying to change things, slowly, moving toward legitimate business, reducing our involvement in the violent aspects of the operation. But tonight, Marco reminded me why that's so dangerous. He saw my attempts at reform as weakness, and now he's pushing to see how far he can go before I push back. So you're going back to being what you were, what your father was. I don't know what other choice I have. The admission seemed to cost him something. If I don't handle Marco decisively, others will see an opportunity. They'll start testing boundaries, pushing limits, until the organization I've spent 10 years building collapses into chaos and civil war. More people will die if I show weakness now than if I make an example of Marco that no one will forget. Margaret took his hand, feeling the tension in his fingers, the barely controlled violence humming through his entire body. What about what you want? Not what your organization needs or what your reputation demands. What does Omar want? He turned to look at her, and the anguish in his expression made her chest ache. I want to be the man you think I can be, the one who solves problems without violence, who builds something legitimate and good, who doesn't carry the weight of every terrible thing he's done like stones in his pockets. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But I don't know if that man exists anywhere except in your imagination. He exists right now, in this moment, sitting here, struggling with this choice, hating what he has to do. The monster your father was wouldn't struggle, he'd just act. And maybe that's exactly the problem. Maybe hesitation, doubt, conscience, they're all luxuries I can't afford. Omar stood abruptly, pacing the small space of her apartment like a caged animal. Do you know what my underboss said when I told him about Marco's threat? He said, "Finally, we've been waiting for you to stop pretending to be something you're not, and remember who you really are." That's what my own people think, that this version of me, the one trying to be better, is the pretense, the performance, and the Reaper is who I really am underneath. That's not true. Isn't it? He spun to face her. I've killed people, Margaret, with my own hands. I've ordered executions, sanctioned violence, built an empire on fear and suffering. Those aren't things I did in some distant past. That's the foundation of everything I am, everything I have. You can't build something good on a foundation of blood and expect it to stand. Then tear down the foundation and start over. You have no idea what you're asking. Omar's voice rose, frustration finally breaking through his control. Starting over means walking away from the organization, means leaving my people without leadership while vultures like Marco circle, waiting to tear apart everything my family built. It means decades of violence as territories get redistributed and power vacuums get filled. Walking away doesn't make me a better man, Margaret. It makes me a coward who abandoned his responsibilities when they became inconvenient. So you're trapped. Is that what you're saying? That there's no way out, no path forward except being exactly what your father was? The question landed like a physical blow. Omar sank back onto the bed, his head in his hands. I don't know. I've been asking myself that question for 10 years. Every time I think I've found a way to evolve the organization into something less brutal, reality reminds me why the brutality exists in the first place. It's not cruelty for its own sake. It's survival. It's maintaining order in a world where the only rule is power, and the moment you stop demonstrating that power, you become prey. Margaret moved closer, her hand resting on his shoulder. What if you didn't face this alone? What if instead of choosing between being the Reaper and being someone better, you figured out how to be both? Someone who can be ruthless when necessary, but who's working toward a future where ruthlessness isn't necessary. That sounds like a fantasy. Maybe, but isn't it worth trying? She turned his face toward hers, forcing him to meet her eyes. You said Marco is testing boundaries. So set boundaries he can't ignore. Show him that threatening me means consequences he can't survive. But do it in a way that doesn't compromise who you're trying to become. There has to be middle ground between rolling over and becoming exactly what your father was. Omar studied her face like she was a puzzle he desperately wanted to solve. You have too much faith in me. I have exactly the right amount of faith. You're the one who's forgotten what you're capable of beyond violence. A knock at the door interrupted them. Tony's voice came through, urgent. Boss, we've got a situation. Black sedan just pulled up across the street. 3 men inside watching the building. Omar was on his feet instantly, his entire demeanor shifting from conflicted to coldly efficient. He pulled out his phone, speaking rapidly in Italian while moving to the window. Whatever response he received made his expression harden further. They're Marco's men. He's escalating faster than I expected. He turned to Margaret. You can't stay here. This apartment isn't secure enough. And now that Marco knows where you live, it's only a matter of time before he makes a more direct move. So what? I'm supposed to just abandon my home? You're supposed to stay alive long enough for me to handle this situation. His tone left no room for argument. Pack whatever you need for a few days. You're coming with me. Omar, this isn't a discussion, Margaret. Marco made his move. Now I'm making mine. And the first move is getting you somewhere he can't touch you. His expression softened slightly. Please, let me protect you. It's the only thing I know how to do right. Margaret looked at this man who carried so much weight, who was torn between the monster he'd been trained to be and the person he desperately wanted to become. She thought about refusing, about insisting on her independence, about all the logical reasons why running with him was a terrible idea. Instead, she pulled her duffel bag from the closet and started packing. For the record, she said quietly, I still think there's a way through this that doesn't end in blood. But I also understand that sometimes you have to fight battles on their terms before you can change the rules of war. Omar watched her pack with an expression that was equal parts relief and regret. I'm going to try, Margaret, to find that middle ground you talked about, to be something more than my worst instincts. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. But if it comes down to choosing between being better and keeping you safe, I'll choose you every time, even if that makes me the monster I've been trying not to be. Then I guess we'll both have to live with that choice. As they left her apartment under heavy guard, Margaret took one last look at her small studio, her safe space that no longer felt safe at all. She'd made her choice weeks ago when she'd first stood up to Omar. Now she was learning what living with that choice actually meant. The war had started, and whether she was ready or not, Margaret was right in the center of it. Omar's secure location turned out to be a townhouse in a quiet neighborhood 30 minutes outside the city. Not the penthouse luxury Margaret had expected, but something softer, more lived in. Wood floors, worn smooth by time. Comfortable furniture that looked actually used. Photographs on the mantel of a woman with Omar's eyes and a smile that suggested she'd known joy before whatever darkness claimed her. This was my mother's house, Omar said quietly, watching Margaret take in the space. She bought it 2 years before she died, said she needed somewhere that felt like home instead of just another property in the family portfolio. I kept it exactly as she left it. Tony and Sal took up positions outside, while 2 other guards Margaret didn't recognize swept the house with practiced efficiency, checking windows, testing locks, setting up some kind of electronic surveillance system that looked far too sophisticated for a suburban townhouse. You'll be safe here, Omar continued. Marco doesn't know about this place. It's not in any database, not connected to the Licari family holdings. My mother made sure of that. She wanted one place where the business couldn't touch her. Margaret set down her duffel bag, exhaustion finally catching up with the adrenaline that had sustained her through the night. How long do I have to hide here? Until I've handled Marco. A few days, maybe a week. He moved to the window, peering through the curtains at the quiet street. I'm meeting with my underboss and key lieutenants in 3 hours. We're planning our response. Your response, not our response. Margaret kept her voice neutral, but the distinction mattered. Omar turned to face her, and the weariness in his expression made him look older than his 38 years. This isn't your fight, Margaret. You got dragged into it because of me, but you don't have to be part of what comes next. What comes next is you going to war with Marco Calvetti, using methods you've spent years trying to move away from, becoming exactly what you've been fighting not to be. She crossed her arms. That sounds like something that affects both of us. Which is why I'm keeping you out of it. Safe. Protected. His jaw tightened. You don't need to see what I'm capable of when someone threatens what's mine. Stop. Margaret's voice cut through his rationalization. Stop pretending this is about protection. You're compartmentalizing, putting me in a box labeled innocent thing to be kept safe so you don't have to face what you're about to do. But I'm not some delicate object on a shelf, Omar. I chose this. I chose you. Which means I get to know the truth about what that choice actually costs. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he crossed to the sofa and sank onto it, his head falling back against the cushions. You want the truth? Fine. Here's the truth. In 3 hours, I'm going to authorize actions that will destroy Marco Calvetti's organization. Not just hurt it. Not just send a message, destroy it completely. His warehouses will burn. His legitimate businesses will suddenly face federal investigations. His key people will either switch loyalty or disappear. And Marco himself, Omar's voice went flat, emotionless. Marco himself will learn what happens when you threaten a Licari. The lesson will be permanent and very public. You're going to kill him. I'm going to make him wish I had. He looked at her then, and the coldness in his eyes was almost unrecognizable. Death is mercy, Margaret. What I'm planning is justice. The kind that makes every other ambitious wannabe think twice before testing me again. Margaret sat beside him, processing the weight of his words. And after? After you've destroyed Marco and reminded everyone why they should fear you, what happens to the man who was trying to be better? I don't know. The admission was barely audible. Maybe he was always a fiction, a story I told myself to pretend I wasn't exactly what everyone always said I was. That's not true. Isn't it? Omar turned to face her, and the anguish in his expression cracked something in her chest. I've been lying to myself, Margaret, thinking I could evolve the organization, make it cleaner, reduce the violence. But the violence is the point. It's not a bug in the system. It's the feature that makes everything else possible. And tonight, Marco reminded me that pretending otherwise was just weakness dressed up as morality. So you're giving up, just accepting that you'll always be the Reaper and nothing more. I'm accepting reality. His voice rose slightly. I'm accepting that trying to be something different while still running this organization is impossible. You can't be a little bit of a monster, Margaret. You either are or you aren't. And I am. I've always been. The past few months with you, they've been beautiful and impossible, and the closest thing to normal I've ever experienced. But they were borrowed time, a fantasy that Marco just violently ended. Margaret felt something crystallize inside her, a clarity born of exhaustion and fear, and the absolute certainty that this moment would define everything that came after. She stood, crossing to where Omar sat, and knelt in front of him so they were eye level. Then walk away. He blinked, clearly not expecting those words. What? Walk away. From the organization. From the violence. From the impossible choice between being the Reaper and being someone you can stand to see in the mirror. Her voice was steady, certain. You said it yourself. You can't be both. So choose. Choose to be the man who's sitting here, torn apart by what he's about to do. Choose to build something new instead of maintaining something that's destroying you. Margaret, it's not that simple. I know it's not simple. I know it would mean losing everything you've built, walking away from the only life you've ever known, probably making enemies of people who used to be allies. I know the consequences would be massive and dangerous and possibly fatal. She took his hands, holding them tightly. But I also know that if you do what you're planning tonight, if you destroy Marco and cement your reputation as the Reaper, you'll lose yourself. And I'll lose you, even if you're standing right in front of me. Omar stared at her like she'd spoken in a language he didn't understand. You're asking me to abandon my family's organization, to walk away from decades of legacy and leave a power vacuum that would tear this city apart. I'm asking you to choose life over legacy. To be brave enough to try something different instead of repeating the same cycle of violence that's defined your family for generations. And what would I even do? Who would I be without the organization? His voice cracked slightly. I've been Omar Lakari, head of the family since I was 28. I don't know how to be anything else. Then learn. We'll figure it out together. Margaret squeezed his hands. You have legitimate businesses, investments, skills beyond violence. You're brilliant at strategy and negotiation. You speak 4 languages. You have a degree in economics from Harvard that you've never used for anything legal. That's not nothing, Omar. That's a foundation for something different. You're asking me to give up everything. I'm asking you to trade everything for something better. For a life where you don't have to be the Reaper anymore, where you can just be Omar. She paused, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Where we can just be us, without the weight of blood and legacy and fear. He pulled his hands free, standing abruptly and moving to the window. And Marco? I'm just supposed to let him threaten you, attack my people and do nothing? Let him think the Lakari family is weak and watch while others follow his example? No, you handle Marco, but you handle him using every tool except violence. You use your legitimate connections to expose his illegal operations. You leverage your business relationships to isolate him financially. You outmaneuver him instead of outmuscling him. Margaret stood too, her conviction growing. You prove that you're more dangerous with a phone call and a checkbook than you ever were with threats and bloodshed. That's idealistic fantasy. Is it? Or is it just harder than falling back on what you've always done? She moved closer to him. You're scared, Omar. Not of Marco. Of the possibility that you might actually be able to walk away, that you might not need to be the Reaper anymore. That terrifies you more than any rival ever could. The words hung between them like a challenge. Omar's jaw worked, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with emotion. Of course I'm scared. Terrified, actually. Because if I walk away and it doesn't work, if Marco or someone else comes after you and I don't have the organization's resources to protect you, then my attempt at being better will be exactly what gets you killed. How do I live with that risk? The same way I'm living with the risk of loving you right now. The words escaped before Margaret could stop them, hanging in the air between them like a confession. The same way I've been living with risk since the moment I told you I wasn't afraid. You don't eliminate danger, Omar. You just decide what's worth the risk. He turned to face her fully, and something in his expression shifted. You love me. I love you, she confirmed, her voice steady despite her racing heart. I love the man who holds doors and listens to my stories about organic chemistry. I love the man who's been trying desperately to be better despite everything in his world telling him it's impossible. I love you, Omar, not the Reaper. Not the head of the Lakari family, you. For a long moment he just stared at her, then he crossed the distance between them in 3 quick steps, his hands framing her face, his forehead pressed against hers. I love you too. The words were barely audible, like a secret he'd been keeping even from himself. I've been in love with you since you stood in that restaurant and refused to back down, since you looked at me and saw something worth saving instead of something to fear. His voice broke slightly. You've been the only good thing in my life for months, Margaret. The only thing that makes me want to be more than what I am. Then be more. Walk away. Build something different. She pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. I know it's terrifying. I know the consequences could be catastrophic. But staying on this path, becoming more of what you've been trying not to be, that's just a slower death. At least this way, we're choosing life, choosing possibility, choosing each other. Omar's thumb traced her cheekbone, his touch gentle, despite the violence he'd been planning just hours before. If I do this, if I walk away, there's no going back. The organization won't just let me retire peacefully, and Marco will see it as ultimate weakness, an invitation to attack. Then we handle those threats when they come, together, with lawyers and federal authorities and every legitimate weapon at our disposal. Margaret covered his hands with hers. You're not powerless without the violence, Omar. You're actually more dangerous, because you're smart and connected and capable of thinking 3 moves ahead. Use those skills for something other than maintaining an empire built on fear. He was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret could see the war playing out behind his eyes. Decades of conditioning fighting against the possibility of something different. Legacy weighing against love. Fear of change battling with exhaustion from being what everyone expected him to be. Finally, he spoke. Okay. Okay? Okay. His voice was stronger now, more certain. I'll walk away. I'll call my underboss in an hour and tell him I'm stepping down, transferring leadership, extracting myself from the organization. I'll use every legal and legitimate resource I have to protect us from Marco and handle the fallout. And I'll do it because you're right. I'd rather risk everything trying to be someone I can stand to be than guarantee survival by becoming more of what I hate. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, relief and terror mixing in equal measure. You're sure? Because once you make this choice, I'm sure. He kissed her forehead, soft and reverent. I'm not sure it'll work. I'm not sure we'll survive what comes next, but I'm absolutely sure that I'd rather try to build something new with you than maintain something I despise without you. She pulled him close, holding him tightly, feeling the tension slowly drain from his body as the decision settled into certainty. We'll figure it out. Whatever comes next, we'll handle it together. Together, he repeated, like he was testing the weight of the word. I've never had together before, yeah. Never had someone I could trust with the full truth of who I am. It's terrifying. Good terrifying or bad terrifying? Both. He pulled back to look at her, and despite everything, there was the ghost of a smile on his lips. Mostly good, though. Mostly the kind of terrifying that feels like possibility instead of threat. Dawn was breaking outside the windows, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Omar made the call to his underboss from his mother's kitchen, his voice steady as he explained his decision to step away from active leadership to transition into a purely advisory role for legitimate business operations to extract himself from the violent aspects of the organization. Margaret could only hear one side of the conversation, but the long silences suggested shocked disbelief on the other end. When Omar finally hung up, his expression was a mixture of relief and something that looked like grief. It's done. He thinks I've lost my mind, but he'll honor my decision. The family has contingencies for leadership transitions. They'll manage. He set down the phone. And now, I'm just Omar, not the Reaper, not the head of the organization, just a man who loves a woman and has no idea what comes next. Margaret crossed to him, taking his hand. What comes next is we handle Marco legally. We protect ourselves smartly, and we start building the life you've been too afraid to imagine. And if it all falls apart, if Marco comes after us and we don't have the organization's protection, then we'll face that together too. But at least you won't have to face it while hating yourself. She squeezed his hand. This is the right choice, Omar. The brave choice. And I'm going to be right here while you figure out who you are without the weight of that legacy. He pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become untethered. I love you, and I'm terrified. And I have no idea if this is the bravest thing I've ever done, or the stupidest. Probably both, Margaret murmured against his chest. But it's ours, our choice, our risk, our future. Outside, the sun continued its rise, indifferent to the seismic shift that had just occurred in one man's life. Omar Lakari had walked away from his empire. The Reaper had laid down his blade, and now, together, they would face whatever came next. The illusion of safety lasted exactly 36 hours. Margaret woke to the sound of Omar's phone ringing insistently in the pre-dawn darkness. She felt him tense beside her, saw the blue light illuminate his face as he read whatever message had come through. His expression went from sleepy to lethal in the space of a heartbeat. Get dressed, now. He was already moving, pulling on clothes with military efficiency. We need to leave. What's happening? Marco just hit La Perlanera, burned it to the ground. Vincent was inside doing inventory. Omar's voice was flat, emotionless, in the way that meant he was barely containing rage. He's in critical condition. And Marco left another message. Said if I won't come to him, he'll burn down everything I care about until there's nothing left. Margaret's hands shook as she pulled on jeans and a sweater. Vincent, is he going to be okay? I don't know. Omar was at the window, phone pressed to his ear, speaking rapid Italian to someone on the other end. When he hung up, his expression was carved from stone. Marco's escalating faster than I anticipated. He thought walking away from the organization would make me vulnerable, an easy target. He's wrong. Omar, you can't go back. You just walked away. I'm not going back. His eyes met hers, dark and determined. But I'm not hiding either. Marco wants a war? I'll give him one, just not the kind he's expecting. The next hour was a blur of phone calls and terse conversations. Omar contacted lawyers, federal prosecutors, business associates, calling in favors and leveraging connections Margaret hadn't known existed. She watched him transform from the conflicted man who'd stepped away from his empire into something sharper, more focused. Not the Reaper returning, but something new. Someone using every weapon except violence. Marco's legitimate businesses are fronts for money laundering, Omar explained as he worked, his fingers flying across his laptop. I've known about it for years, kept that information as insurance. Now I'm handing everything to the FBI, tax records, shipping manifests, communications between him and his underbosses. Everything. Will it be enough? To put him away? Eventually, but not fast enough to stop him from burning down everything else I care about while he's still free. Omar's jaw tightened. Which which is why I'm also liquidating certain accounts he doesn't know I control, accounts that will tank his legitimate operations within 48 hours. No criminal activity required, just capitalism working exactly as designed. Tony appeared in the doorway. "Boss, we have a problem. Marco's men just grabbed 2 of our former associates, the ones who helped with your transition away from active leadership. They're sending a message about loyalty." Omar's hands stilled on the keyboard. "Where?" "The old warehouse district. Marco wants you to know exactly where they are. He's baiting you." "Of course he is." Omar stood, his expression grim. "He thinks I'll either come running to save them, which lets him take me out, or I'll do nothing, which makes me look weak to everyone watching. It's a good strategy. Would have worked on the old me." "What are you going to do?" Margaret asked quietly. Something he won't expect. Omar pulled out his phone again, dialing a number with deliberate precision. "Agent Morrison, this is Omar Likari. Yes, that Omar Likari. I have information about a hostage situation currently in progress, and I'd like to report a kidnapping." Margaret's eyes widened as she realized what he was doing. Using the authorities, turning Marco's trap into his own by involving law enforcement instead of handling it personally. The address is 4800 Industrial Boulevard, Warehouse 12. The perpetrator is Marco Calvetti. He's holding 2 men against their will as part of an ongoing criminal enterprise. Omar's voice was calm, professional. "I'm willing to provide testimony and evidence. Yes, I understand what that means for me. I'm prepared to accept those consequences." When he hung up, the room was silent, except for the sound of distant sirens already responding to his call. "You just involved the FBI," Tony said, his voice carefully neutral. "In family business." "There is no family business anymore. I walked away, remember?" Omar's expression was hard. Marco wanted to play games with people's lives. Now he gets to play with federal prosecutors instead. See how that works out for him. The day unfolded in a cascade of consequences. Federal agents raided 3 of Marco's properties simultaneously. The 2 hostages were recovered, traumatized but alive. And by noon, Marco Calvetti was in federal custody, facing charges that would keep him locked up for decades, even if only half of them stuck. But Omar's gambit came with a price. "They want you to come in for questioning," his lawyer informed him over speakerphone. "Nothing formal yet, but they're very interested in how you happen to have detailed knowledge of Marco Calvetti's criminal operations. And they're asking questions about the Likari family's activities over the past decade." "Let them ask." Omar's voice was steady. "I'll cooperate fully. Tell them I'll come in tomorrow morning with complete records of everything I know about organized crime in this city, on one condition. Margaret Hayes gets full immunity for any association with me or my former organization. She's an innocent party who got caught in crossfire that had nothing to do with her." Margaret grabbed his arm. "Omar, you can't do that. You'll be putting yourself at risk." "I'm already at risk, have been since the moment I decided to walk away." He covered her hand with his. "But you don't have to be. If cooperating with federal authorities means keeping you safe and free, then that's what I'm doing." No discussion. "The prosecutor will want a lot more than just information about Marco," the lawyer warned. "They've been trying to build cases against organized crime families for years. You're potentially their golden ticket." "Then I guess I'm testifying." Omar's expression was resolute. "Whatever it takes to dismantle the system that made monsters like Marco think they could burn down restaurants and threaten innocent people without consequences." The lawyer was quiet for a moment. "You understand what you're agreeing to. Witness protection potentially. Permanent separation from your former associates. a target on your back for the rest of your life from people who see cooperation as the ultimate betrayal. I understand perfectly. After the call ended, Margaret turned to face Omar fully. You're sacrificing everything. Your reputation, your safety, possibly your freedom. For what? For you. His voice was simple, certain. For a future where we're not constantly looking over our shoulders. For the possibility of building something clean instead of maintaining something corrupt. He cupped her face in his hands. I spent 10 years being the Reaper, Margaret, making decisions based on power and control and fear. This is me making a different choice, choosing justice over revenge, choosing you over everything else. But the consequences will be worth it. No matter what happens next, no matter what price I pay for cooperating with authorities, it'll be worth it, because I'll be free of the weight I've been carrying since I was 28 years old, free to be someone other than what my father's legacy demanded, free to love you without that darkness hanging over everything. Margaret felt tears slip down her cheeks. I love you, and I'm terrified of what comes next. Me too. He pulled her close, his arms wrapped around her like shelter. But we're terrified together. That has to count for something. The next 48 hours passed in a haze of lawyers and federal agents and careful negotiations. Omar provided evidence that would unravel organized crime networks throughout the city. He testified about operations, identified key players, handed over documentation that prosecutors had been chasing for decades. In return, Margaret received full immunity and protection. Omar was placed in a form of limited witness protection. Not the full program, but enough security to discourage retaliation from former associates who viewed his cooperation as treason. The cost was everything he'd known. The Licari family officially severed ties with him, declaring him persona non grata in their circles. Former allies became enemies overnight. His legitimate business holdings had to be placed in trust to avoid scrutiny. The life he'd built, corrupt as its foundations were, crumbled into rubble. But standing in the small apartment the federal authorities had set up as temporary housing, watching Margaret unpack their limited belongings with determined optimism, Omar felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. It's not much, Margaret said, surveying the modest two-bedroom with its generic furniture and blank walls. But it's ours. Clean. No blood on the foundation. Omar crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. It's perfect. You're perfect. This whole impossible situation is perfect because I'm choosing it, instead of having it chosen for me by legacy and fear. She tilted her face up to kiss him, soft and lingering. Vincent's going to be okay. I called the hospital. 3rd-degree burns and smoke inhalation, but he'll recover, and the staff from La Perlanera, they're all safe. Marco didn't hurt anyone else. Because I acted fast enough. Because I used the tools I'd been too proud to consider before. Omar rested his forehead against hers. I spent a decade believing that violence was the only real power, that legal systems and proper channels were for people too weak to take what they wanted directly. You taught me that real strength is choosing the harder path, the one that doesn't compromise who you're trying to become. We taught each other. Margaret's smile was soft. You showed me that people can change, that redemption is possible, even when the starting point seems impossibly dark. We're both different people than we were 6 months ago. A knock at the door interrupted them. Omar tensed automatically, old instincts dying hard, but it was just Agent Morrison with paperwork requiring signatures. The prosecutor wants you to know that Marco Calvetti accepted a plea deal, Morrison informed them. 25 years, no possibility of parole for at least 15. The evidence you provided was instrumental. And the Licari organization? Undergoing significant restructuring under new leadership. Your former underboss has committed to moving toward entirely legitimate operations within 5 years. Whether he actually follows through remains to be seen, but your cooperation has definitely shifted the landscape. Morrison's expression softened slightly. You did a good thing here, Mr. Licari. Dangerous, probably crazy, but good. After the agent left, Margaret and Omar stood together at the window, looking out at the city that had defined both their lives in different ways. Somewhere out there, La Perla Nera's ruins were still smoldering. Somewhere Vincent was recovering in a hospital bed. Somewhere, the Licari organization was adapting to leadership that wasn't Omar. What do we do now? Margaret asked quietly, after the dust settles and the immediate danger passes. Who are we without the restaurant and the organization and all the structure that defined us? Omar was quiet for a long moment, considering. We figure it out. Together. You finish nursing school. I figure out what legitimate business actually looks like when you're not using it to launder money or hide criminal operations. We build something small and real instead of something massive and corrupt. That sounds almost normal. Terrifying, right? His arms tightened around her, but also kind of wonderful. The possibility of ordinary life with extraordinary love instead of extraordinary power with ordinary loneliness. Margaret leaned back against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the warmth of his breath against her hair. I choose this. Choose us. Choose the uncertain future over the certain misery of living in fear. Me too. Omar pressed a kiss to her temple. Best choice I ever made. Second only to not having you arrested that night you told me you weren't afraid. She laughed, the sound bright in the small apartment. I was absolutely terrified. I know, but you stood your ground anyway. That's what made me fall in love with you, that courage to face something terrifying and choose defiance over submission. Says the man who just dismantled his own empire and testified against organized crime to keep me safe. Fair point. His smile was soft against her hair. I guess we're both braver than we thought, or stupider, possibly both. As night fell over the city, Margaret and Omar remained at the window, watching lights flicker to life across the skyline. Somewhere out there, Marco Calvetti sat in a federal detention facility, his empire destroyed. Somewhere, the Licari organization was adapting to Omar's absence, learning to function without the Reaper's iron control. And here, in a modest apartment with uncertain futures and federal protection, two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances held each other close and chose to believe that love might actually be enough. It wouldn't be easy. The consequences of Omar's choices would follow them for years. Former associates would see him as a traitor. The life they'd known was gone completely, replaced with something smaller and more vulnerable. But as Margaret turned in Omar's arms to kiss him properly, deeply, with all the love and fear and hope she carried, she knew with absolute certainty that they'd made the right choice and they'd chosen each other over everything else, chosen possibility over power, chosen love over legacy. And that, Margaret reflected, as Omar lifted her into his arms and carried her toward the bedroom, was the bravest thing either of them had ever done. The war was over, the sacrifice complete. And now, finally, they could begin building something worth keeping. 6 months later, Margaret stood in front of the bathroom mirror of their small apartment, adjusting the collar of her brand new scrubs. The hospital ID badge clipped to her pocket read, Margaret Hayes, RN, Pediatric Oncology. She'd passed her nursing boards 3 weeks ago, and today was her first official shift at Children's Memorial Hospital. Her hands trembled slightly as she braided her auburn hair over one shoulder, not from fear, but from the overwhelming reality that she'd actually made it. Despite everything that had happened with Omar, Marco, and the complete upheaval of her life, she'd finished school and achieved the dream she'd been working toward for years. "You look beautiful." Omar's voice came from the doorway. He leaned against the frame, already dressed in the casual business attire he'd adopted for his new consulting work. No more expensive suits that cost thousands. No more platinum cufflinks or watches that could pay someone's rent. Just simple, comfortable clothing for a man rebuilding his life from scratch. "I look terrified," Margaret corrected, turning to face him. "That too, but mostly beautiful." He crossed to her, his hands settling on her waist. "You're going to be incredible. Those kids are lucky to have you. What if I'm not ready? What if I freeze or make a mistake or—" "Then you'll handle it, the same way you've handled everything else these past 6 months. His smile was soft, genuine. "You stood up to a mafia boss, survived a gang war, and helped me dismantle an organized crime empire. I think you can handle your first day as a pediatric oncology nurse." Margaret laughed despite her nerves, leaning into his warmth. "When you put it that way, it does sound manageable." They'd settled into a routine over the past months, one built on the ordinary rhythms of normal life that neither of them had experienced before. Omar worked as a business consultant for small companies, using his strategic mind and economic degree for legitimate purposes. The pay was a fraction of what he'd been accustomed to, but he approached each project with the same intensity he'd once applied to criminal enterprises. Margaret had thrown herself into the final semester of nursing school, studying late into the night while Omar cooked dinner and quizzed her on pharmacology. They'd learned to navigate grocery shopping, utility bills, and the strange domesticity of building a life together without bodyguards or federal agents constantly hovering. It wasn't always easy. Some nights Omar woke from nightmares about his past, about decisions he couldn't undo, and people he'd hurt. Margaret would hold him through the darkness, reminding him that growth meant facing the consequences of who he'd been while still choosing to be someone better. Other times, Margaret found herself jumping at sudden noises or checking over her shoulder when she walked alone, the hypervigilance from those terrifying weeks with Marco still lingering in her nervous system. Omar would talk her through the panic attacks, his voice steady and calm, until she remembered that they were safe now, as safe as they could be. "What time is your first consultation?" Margaret asked, checking her watch. "Not until 10. I'll walk you to the subway first." It had become their morning ritual. Omar insisted on accompanying her to the station, his protective instincts still operational even though the immediate threat had passed. They walked through their neighborhood in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the city wake up around them. It was a different city than the one Omar had once controlled, or maybe they were just seeing it differently now. Not as territories to be managed or threats to be neutralized, but simply as home. At the subway entrance, Omar pulled her close for a long kiss. "Be brilliant today. Save lives. Make those kids smile. You too. Help small businesses thrive. Use your powers for good instead of evil. That's the plan." His smile held traces of the old dangerous charm, but softer now, more genuine. "I love you, Margaret Hayes." "I love you too, Omar Lakari." She still used his real name, refusing to let him hide behind the anonymity the witness protection program had offered. He was who he was, past and present, and she loved all of it. The hospital was overwhelming in its organized chaos. Margaret spent her first hours following her preceptor through rounds, meeting the children whose courage humbled her, learning the rhythms of the pediatric oncology floor. By lunch, her feet ached and her brain felt stuffed with information, but something in her chest had settled into certainty. This was right. This was where she belonged. "You're a natural," her preceptor, an experienced nurse named Patricia, told her during their break. "The kids respond to you. That's a gift, not something you can teach." Margaret thought about the skills she'd learned over the past year that couldn't be taught. How to stand your ground against powerful men, how to love someone despite knowing their darkest truths, how to choose courage over safety and still somehow survive. "Thank you. I've had good teachers about facing fear with grace." That evening she came home exhausted and exhilarated to find Omar cooking dinner in their tiny kitchen. Something simple, pasta with vegetables, but the domesticity of it made her heart swell. "How was it?" he asked, not turning from the stove. "Perfect. Terrifying and overwhelming and absolutely perfect." She wrapped her arms around him from behind, pressing her face against his back. "How was your day?" "Good. Helped a family restaurant restructure their business model to improve profitability. Reminded me a bit of Valentino's, actually." His voice grew quieter. "Vincent called today." Margaret tensed. They'd visited Vincent twice during his recovery, but the conversations had been awkward, loaded with unspoken questions about what had happened and why. "What did he say?" "He's opening a new place, smaller, more intimate. Asked if I wanted to invest as a silent partner. Legitimate investment, proper contracts, everything legal." Omar turned to face her. "I told him I'd think about it." "Do you want to?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to support him after what he went through because of my association with him, but another part worries that staying connected to anything from that old life is dangerous, for both of us." Margaret considered, choosing her words carefully. "Vincent was kind to me. He tried to protect me even when it put him at risk. And he's not asking you to be the reaper. He's asking Omar, the business consultant, to help with a legitimate venture. That seems different." "Maybe." Omar returned his attention to the pasta, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "I just want to make sure every choice I make now is pushing us forward, not pulling us back into patterns we've fought so hard to leave behind." They ate dinner together at the small table by the window, sharing details of their days like any normal couple. But there was nothing truly normal about them, and they both knew it. Normal couples didn't have federal protection. Normal couples didn't carry the weight of dismantled criminal empires and narrow escapes from gang warfare. But maybe, Margaret thought, as she watched Omar's face in the candlelight, normal was overrated anyway. "I've been thinking," Omar said as they cleaned up together, falling into the easy rhythm they'd developed, "about what comes next, for us. What comes next is we keep doing this, building our lives, paying our bills, being boring and domestic. I want more than that." He dried his hands on a towel, turning to face her fully. "I want to marry you, Margaret. Not right away, not until you're ready, but eventually. I want to make this official, permanent. I want everyone to know that you're mine, and I'm yours. And that we chose this life together." Margaret's breath caught. "Omar, I know it's complicated. I know my past makes everything complicated, but I also know that you're the best thing that ever happened to me, and I don't want to spend another day not telling you that I intend to spend the rest of my life earning the gift of your presence." His voice was steady, certain. "So I'm asking, not now, but someday soon, will you marry me?" She crossed to him, her hands framing his face. "Yes, someday soon, when we're ready, when we've had more time to build this foundation. Yes, I'll marry you." The kiss that followed was deep and tender, full of promise and hope and the weight of everything they'd survived together. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Omar rested his forehead against hers. "I don't deserve you." "Probably not. But you're stuck with me anyway." Margaret's smile was soft. "We're building something here, Omar. Something clean and good, and ours. That's worth more than any empire." Over the following weeks, they settled deeper into their new life. Omar accepted Vincent's offer, becoming a silent investor in the new restaurant with proper legal documentation and transparent financial arrangements. Margaret excelled at the hospital, her natural compassion and hard-won courage making her exactly the kind of nurse those frightened children needed. They had dinner with Vincent at his new place the night before the grand opening. It was smaller than La Perlinera, more intimate, with exposed brick and Edison bulbs that reminded Margaret painfully of the original. But there was also something lighter about it, as if Vincent too was building something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed. To new beginnings, Vincent raised his glass, his voice still carrying traces of the smoke damage to his lungs, and to the courage to start over when everything falls apart. To new beginnings, Omar and Margaret echoed, clinking glasses. As they walked home that night through streets that no longer felt threatening, Margaret thought about how far they'd come. 6 months ago, she'd been hiding in a safe house while Omar dismantled his life to protect her. Now they were just two people building something ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Walking away from everything you knew?" Omar was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I regret the things I did before I walked away, the people I hurt, the fear I caused, the darkness I spread. But walking away itself, choosing you, choosing this life." He squeezed her hand. "Never, not for a second. Even though you lost everything." "I didn't lose everything. I lost an empire built on suffering and gained a life built on love. That's not a loss, Margaret. That's the best trade I ever made." They stopped at a small park near their apartment, sitting on a bench under the stars. The city hummed around them, indifferent to their story, full of its own dramas and transformations. "I want to do something," Omar said suddenly. "Something to make amends for the damage I caused, not for forgiveness or redemption, because I'm not sure those are things I deserve, but just to try to put something good back into the world." "Like what?" "A foundation for kids whose parents are incarcerated or killed by gang violence, scholarships, counseling, support services, using my knowledge of that world to help kids escape it instead of perpetuating the cycle." He turned to look at her. "What do you think?" Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "I think that's exactly the kind of thing someone who's truly changed would do, not because it erases the past, but because it acknowledges it while still choosing to be better." "Will you help me? With the foundation? You understand what those kids need in ways I never will." "Of course I'll help you. We're partners, remember? In everything." 3 months later, they stood together in a small office space, surrounded by donated furniture and second-hand computers, officially launching the Lakari Foundation for at-risk youth. The name had been Margaret's idea. "Don't run from who you were," she'd told him. "Reclaim it. Make the Lakari name mean something other than fear." The first recipient of their scholarship was a 15-year-old girl whose father was serving time for his role in Marco Calvetti's organization. She'd been trying to finish high school while working 2 jobs to support her younger siblings. The foundation would pay for her education and provide support services for her entire family. "This is what power should look like," Margaret said, as they watched the girl sign the scholarship acceptance paperwork, tears streaming down her face. Not control through fear, but support through compassion. Omar's arms settled around her waist, pulling her close. "I never would have figured that out without you. Never would have known this kind of power existed." They'd been living in their modest apartment for nearly a year when Omar came home one evening with an unexpected announcement. The federal prosecutor called. They're dropping the witness protection protocols. Marco's still locked up, and his organization has completely dissolved. There's no active threat against us anymore. Margaret looked up from the medical journal she'd been reading. So we're free? Completely free? As free as we can be. We'll always have to be careful. There might always be someone from my old life who holds a grudge, but the immediate organized danger is gone. He sat beside her on the couch. We can go anywhere, do anything, build our life however we want without federal oversight. Do you want to leave? Start completely fresh somewhere new? Omar was quiet, considering. Part of me does, but another part wants to stay here. Prove that we can build something good in the same place where everything was once so dark. Show that transformation is possible even without running away. I like that second part. Margaret set down her journal, curling into his side. I like the idea of reclaiming this city, making it ours in a different way. Then we stay. We keep building. The foundation, your nursing career, my consulting work. We plant roots instead of running. That night, as they lay tangled together in bed, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that first confrontation in La Perlanera to this quiet moment of domesticity, they'd traveled miles that had nothing to do with physical distance. Are you happy? She asked into the darkness. Yes. Omar's answer was immediate, certain. Not in the way I thought happiness looked when I had power and money and fear at my disposal, but genuinely, deeply happy in ways I didn't know existed. You? Happier than I ever imagined possible. She pressed a kiss to his chest, right over his heart. We made it, Omar. Through everything, we actually made it to the other side. We did. Together. His arms tightened around her. Always together from now on. As sleep claimed them both, wrapped in each other's warmth and the security of their hard-won peace, neither could know what challenges the future still held. There would be difficult days ahead, moments when the past threatened to drag them back, times when the easy choice would be to fall into old patterns. But they'd proven something essential over the past year, that love could be stronger than legacy, that courage could overcome fear, that two people committed to change could actually transform not just themselves, but the world around them. Tomorrow, Margaret would go back to the hospital and hold the hand of a frightened 6-year-old starting chemotherapy. Omar would review applications for the Foundation's next round of scholarships. They'd come home to their small apartment and cook dinner together, sharing the mundane details of their extraordinary, ordinary lives. And that, they'd discovered, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. 2 years after that first confrontation at La Perlanera, Margaret stood in the elegant ballroom of the Grand Harbor Hotel, adjusting the simple ivory dress she'd chosen for their wedding. It wasn't the elaborate affair that Omar could have once afforded, back when money flowed from questionable sources, and his name commanded fear rather than respect. Instead, it was intimate, meaningful, attended by the people who'd supported their transformation, rather than those who'd benefited from Omar's former life. You ready? Patricia, her nursing colleague and now maid of honor, asked from the doorway. Margaret looked at her reflection one final time. The shy, timid waitress, who'd once moved through La Perlanera like a ghost, was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more certain. A woman who'd faced down dangers most people only imagined and come out the other side with her compassion intact, but her spine made of steel. I've been ready since the moment he asked. She turned from the mirror, smoothing the soft fabric of her dress. Actually, I've been ready since the night I told him I wasn't afraid. Everything since then has just been details. The ceremony was held in a small garden overlooking the harbor, the late afternoon sun painting everything in shades of gold. Vincent had closed his restaurant for the day to cater, insisting it was the least he could do for the couple whose choices had inadvertently saved his life by forcing him to rebuild something better than what had burned. Omar stood at the makeshift altar, flanked by 2 friends from his consulting firm rather than the bodyguards and underbosses who would have attended in his former life. He wore a simple gray suit, no platinum cufflinks or expensive watch. Just a man waiting for his bride with an expression that mixed nervousness and absolute certainty. When Margaret walked down the aisle, their eyes met and held. In that look past everything they'd survived together, the confrontation that started it all, the threats from Marco, the terrifying choice to walk away from power, the slow, difficult work of building something clean from the ruins of what had been destroyed. The officiant, a retired judge who'd once prosecuted organized crime cases and now ran a legal aid clinic Omar volunteered with, spoke about transformation and redemption, about the courage it took to choose change over comfort. Marriage is a promise to keep choosing each other, the judge said, looking between them with knowing eyes. Not just in the easy moments, but especially in the difficult ones, to witness each other's evolution and support it, even when that evolution is uncomfortable or scary. When it came time for vows, Omar spoke first, his voice steady, despite the emotion in his eyes. Margaret, 2 years ago you looked at me and saw something worth saving, when everyone else, including myself, saw only a monster. You gave me permission to be more than my worst actions, more than the legacy I inherited. You taught me that real strength isn't about control or fear, but about the courage to be vulnerable, to admit mistakes, to choose growth over pride. He took her hands, his grip gentle but firm. I promise to spend every day of our life together being worthy of that gift, to choose compassion over cruelty, to build rather than destroy, to use whatever power I have to lift up instead of tear down. I promise to be your partner in creating a future that honors who we want to be, not who we were. I love you, Margaret Hayes. You saved my life in every way that matters. Margaret felt tears slip down her cheeks as she began her own vows. Omar, you taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but moving forward despite it. That people are capable of profound change when they're brave enough to face the truth of who they've been and committed enough to become someone better. You've shown me what it looks like to tear down everything you've built and start over with nothing but love and determination as your foundation. She squeezed his hands. I promise to walk beside you through whatever comes next, to remind you on the hard days that transformation is possible and on the good days that you've already achieved it, to be your witness, your partner, your home. I love you, Omar Likari, not despite your past, but because of how you've chosen to move beyond it. The judge pronounced them married, and Omar pulled Margaret into a kiss that was both tender and fierce, a promise sealed with every ounce of feeling they'd fought so hard to protect. The reception was small, but joyful. Vincent's food was extraordinary, even better than what he'd served at La Perla Nera. The children from the Foundation Scholarship Program had made decorations, their artwork covering the walls with bright colors and hopeful messages. Former colleagues from the hospital mingled with Omar's consulting clients, creating a tapestry of their new life. To the bride and groom, Vincent raised his glass during the toast, his voice still carrying traces of roughness from the smoke damage. Who proved that the bravest thing you can do is choose to be better, even when the cost is everything you've known. May your future be as bright as your courage deserves. As the sun set over the harbor, Omar and Margaret swayed together on the makeshift dance floor, lost in their own world despite the celebration around them. What are you thinking? Margaret asked, her head resting against his chest. That 2 years ago I would have thought this impossible. A wedding without my organization's presence, a life built on legitimate work and honest relationships, happiness that doesn't require fear or control to maintain. His arms tightened around her. I keep waiting for it to feel fragile, temporary, but it doesn't. It feels solid in a way nothing in my old life ever did. That's because it's real, built on truth instead of lies, on love instead of fear. She pulled back to look at him. We did this. Omar, we tore down everything and rebuilt something beautiful. We're still rebuilding, still figuring it out. His smile was soft. The foundation needs expansion funding. Your hospital is talking about making you head nurse of the pediatric oncology department. We're thinking about buying a house instead of renting. Normal problems, normal dreams. Normal is good. Normal is what we fought for. Later that night, in the hotel suite that served as their wedding night accommodation, they stood together on the balcony overlooking the city. The skyline glittered with possibility. The same view Omar had once commanded from his penthouse, but now observed as just another person building a life. Do you ever miss it? Margaret asked quietly. The power, the respect, the certainty of your old role? Omar was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the honesty their relationship demanded. Sometimes. Usually when things are difficult at work, or when we're struggling to make the foundation's budget work, or when some former associate sees me on the street and looks away like I don't exist. He turned to face her. But then I come home to you. I see the scholarship recipients succeeding. I help a small business owner figure out sustainable growth. And I remember that the power I had before came at a cost I'm no longer willing to pay. No regrets then? Only about the time I wasted being who everyone expected instead of discovering who I actually wanted to be. His hand settled on her waist. But no regrets about us, about this choice, about building a life that lets me sleep at night instead of keeping me awake with guilt and paranoia. Margaret pulled him close, feeling the steady beat of his heart against hers. What do you want for our future? 5 years from now? 10 years? What do you see? Honestly, I see us expanding the foundation into multiple cities. I see you as head of the pediatric oncology program, maybe even opening a clinic for underserved families. I see us in a house with a yard, maybe even kids of our own someday. His voice grew softer. I see us growing old together, still choosing each other every day, still building something that matters. Kids? Margaret pulled back to look at him, surprise and warmth mixing in her chest. Someday, when we're ready, when I've had more time to prove that I can be the kind of father who breaks the cycle instead of perpetuating it. Uncertainty flickered across his features. Is that something you'd want? Knowing my history, my genetics, the darkness I come from? You're not your history, Omar. You're your choices. And every choice you've made since we met has been toward light instead of darkness. She cupped his face in her hands. Yes, someday, when we're both ready, I'd love to have children with you. To raise them in a home built on honesty and compassion instead of fear and violence. The kiss that followed was deep and full of promise, a physical manifestation of every hope they carried for their future together. As they finally retreated inside, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From that first confrontation where she'd found courage she didn't know she possessed, through the terrifying escalation with Marco, to Omar's decision to walk away from everything he'd known. Every step had felt impossible at the time, but somehow they'd managed it together. I love you, Omar murmured against her hair as they lay tangled together later, the city lights filtering through the curtains. More than I knew it was possible to love anyone. You're my redemption, my hope, my home. I love you too, and you're not my redemption because I never needed saving. Margaret's fingers traced patterns on his chest. But you're my partner, my mirror, my proof that choosing courage over fear is always worth it. They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other, and the security of promises made and kept. The next morning, as they packed for the modest honeymoon they'd planned, a trip to a small coastal town where no one knew their history or cared about Omar's former reputation, Margaret found herself reflecting on how far they'd come. "Ready to start our new life, Mrs. Likari?" Omar asked, using her married name for the first time. "I've been living our new life for 2 years now. This just makes it official." She smiled at him. "But yes, ready for whatever comes next, as long as we face it together." They drove out of the city as the sun rose, leaving behind the streets where Omar had once ruled through fear and Margaret had once moved invisibly through the shadows. Ahead lay uncertainty, challenges they couldn't predict, obstacles they'd have to navigate together. But they also carried something precious, the knowledge that they'd already survived the impossible, that love could be stronger than legacy, that people could change, not through dramatic gestures, but through daily choices to be better than they were yesterday. As the city disappeared in the rearview mirror, Margaret reached across the console to take Omar's hand. He squeezed back, his grip steady and sure. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing me when I was invisible behind my reputation, for believing I could be more than what I was, for standing your ground that night at La Perlanera instead of backing down." His voice was thick with emotion. "For saving my life by giving me a reason to want to be saved." "We saved each other." Margaret brought his hand to her lips, pressing a kiss to his knuckles. "You showed me I was braver than I knew, that standing up for what's right is worth the risk, that love isn't about safety. It's about choosing someone despite the danger and building something worth protecting." The coastal highway stretched before them, full of possibility and promise. Behind them lay the ruins of who they'd been, the destruction necessary for transformation. Ahead lay the future they would build together, one honest day at a time. "What are you thinking about?" Omar asked, glancing at her with a soft smile. "That 2 years ago, I was a waitress afraid of her own shadow, and you were a mafia boss afraid of being human. And now we're just 2 people who love each other, heading toward a future we get to create instead of inherit." She smiled back at him. "It's pretty extraordinary when you think about it." "Extraordinary barely covers it." Omar's laugh was warm, genuine, the sound of a man who'd found peace after years of war. "I love you, Margaret Likari. Thank you for making the impossible possible." "I love you too, Omar. Now drive. Our future is waiting, and I don't want to waste another minute of it." As they continued down the highway, the morning sun painting everything in shades of gold and promise, Margaret felt a contentment so profound it almost hurt. This was what they'd fought for. Not a perfect life, but a real one. Not a safe existence, but an honest one. Not a relationship without challenges, but a partnership strong enough to face whatever challenges came. They'd torn down an empire and built a home. They'd chosen love over legacy, truth over power, each other over everything else, and in doing so they'd proven that redemption wasn't just possible. It was inevitable when 2 people were brave enough to demand it from themselves and each other. The future lay ahead, uncertain, but theirs to shape. And that, Margaret reflected, as the city disappeared completely behind them, an open road stretched endlessly forward, was the greatest gift of all. The freedom to write their own story together, one courageous choice at a time.